Thank you very much for joining us. We wanted a very intimate conversation, and so you joined us in this intimate room, and we're extremely grateful for our hosts for helping to set up this meeting. As you can imagine, Friday, end of the day, session going, room's tough to come by, so very appreciative to the members who have hosted this, and in particular I want to thank Mr. Wolf, Mr. Fattah, Senator Whitehouse, and Senator Cornyn for what they've done to really champion the work of justice reinvestment that we'll talk about. And for this room today, I want to thank Mr. Wolf, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Chavis, Congressman Scott, and Congressman Schiff. So thank you very much for all that you've done. What we're going to talk a lot about today is justice reinvestment, and again, this is really the result of an extraordinary bipartisan effort across the Senate and the House to really help states find ways to reduce spending on corrections and increase public safety. And so we have a terrific panel here that I'm going to introduce before they speak. But I want to start with Denise O'Donnell, who's the Director of the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is a division of the Office of Justice Programs in the U.S. Department of Justice. Director O'Donnell is someone who really gets it from a state perspective as the person who ran the entire criminal justice system in New York State and has a terrific background as a prosecutor. And so we're thrilled that she was tapped to run BJA. And Director O'Donnell, we'd love for you just to talk a little bit about the administration and the Department of Justice's perspective on justice reinvestment.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to the Council of State Governments for putting together and making the arrangements for this wonderful event today. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this event. We are so excited to be here today with some of the leaders and the state champions of the JRI effort to tell you about some of the accomplishments of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative and, more importantly, the future potential of JRI. So we're just very excited to be here, and I would be remiss were I not to thank the staffers and particularly your members who have the confidence to appropriate funds to BJA for important public safety initiatives like JRI. I can tell you that we take our responsibilities to be careful stewards of those funds and to make sure that those funds are invested in a way that makes sense and is based really on evidence-based programs and policies. So thank you for your confidence in BJA. So justice reinvestment is a bipartisan, data-driven criminal justice approach to assist states in reining in the escalating costs of incarceration and reinvest cost savings in high-performing programs that work to reduce recidivism and make our communities safer. It's such an important initiative, and the time for it is so critically important right now. JRI is a partnership, so it's a strong public-private partnership with the Pew Charitable Trust, who has devoted substantial resources to support JRI, the Council of State Governments, Justice Center, VERA, the Center for Effective Public Policy, and the Crime and Justice Institute. In addition, the Urban Institute is doing an assessment of JRI. So we have a lot of strong partners and a lot of very experienced training and technical assistance partners who really are part of the important key to success of JRI. So it has two phases. Phase one is a critical phase when top state policy makers, the governor, the chief judge, leaders in the legislature, come together and agree to work with our training and technical assistance providers to do a thorough analysis of their criminal justice data and to identify what are driving the costs of incarceration in their state. They agree to come together to consider policy options that are evidence-based, to look at how they can reduce costs that are escalating in corrections spending. And they agree on a set of policy objectives that they try to enact or work to enact through legislation. Phase 2 is a critical stage of JRI when we focus on implementation of the legislative changes that have been agreed to as part of JRI. I'd like to talk to you just very briefly about why it's so important. I think we all know that the costs of incarceration are escalating at the state level throughout our country. It has changed from a $12 billion cost in state spending for corrections in 1988 to more than $52 billion in 2011. Because of the financial constraints and declining revenues, this approach is really in demand at many of the states. The Lessons Learned publication, which we've released today as part of our partnership, show the experiences of a number of states who've had great success through JRI. So we know that the demand is great. And as you will hear, JRI is a very effective approach. Many states just don't have the ability to do that kind of data analysis and policy review to make these kinds of system-wide changes. So it is such an effective strategy because of the expertise that TTA providers are able to provide to the states. Third, it's uniquely tailored to each state. And I believe that part of the potential of JRI is that it affords the policymakers in each state to make their own choices about how to go about this task of justice reinvestment. So it's leaders like the folks you're going to hear about that determine the options that are best for their state, and more importantly, the changes that they could make in their state. And fourth, it really has tremendous potential to incentivize states to invest in evidence-based programs and practices that work in public safety. And that's a mission that I think all of us have and want to move forward. I believe it's so important that the Justice Department is involved in this initiative because our focus on reducing crime and making our communities safer. So I think and hope that we are playing a critical role in this important initiative. But it's the people in this room who really have made justice reinvestment work in their states that I think can tell you really what are the keys to success of JRI. So I'll turn it over to them.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you, Director O'Donnell. So I'm going to do a very quick overview of the Justice Reinvestment Project and how it came to be, and then we're going to have a conversation with our state officials here who are with me. So when we came to Michigan, for example, the state director of the Department of Corrections there pointed out that 1 out of every 4 people working for state government worked for the Department of Corrections. When we worked in Vermont, they pointed out that they went from spending 3% of their budget on corrections in the mid-1990s to 12% of their state spending on corrections by 2005. It was a Pac-Man in state budgets, eating into every other budget priority. This is Governor Corbett from Pennsylvania, former Attorney General, Republican governor for whom Secretary Wetzel at the end of the table works. You'll see here talking about 95% of the budget pie, and one of the huge slices of that budget pie is corrections. And as he says, we can either raise taxes or figure out a way to cut spending on corrections, and I'm not going to raise taxes. So really interesting focus on how we can potentially save money by looking at the corrections system. Many people, when they look at the correction system, say, well, it's an expense that we have to make. We recognize that when we actually incarcerate people, the crime rate goes down. And if you look here, you'll see in Florida, for example, the incarceration rate went up by 16%, and indeed there was a significant drop in the crime rate over the same time period. Yet if you look at these other states, you'll see that they actually dropped their incarceration rates over the same time period, and you'll see that they there saw a drop in the crime rate as well. So while there certainly is an undeniable impact of taking people off the streets and incapacitating folks, we can't simply say that by locking people up there's an automatic corresponding impact on crime. It was in other states, and we've made this point and highlighted their incarceration rates and crime rates. So from that came this Justice Reinvestment Project that has been funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Pew Charitable Trusts. It has 2 phases, and Justice Reinvestment is not a policy, right? It's not a particular program. It's just an approach. It's an approach where the states come together, a state, and basically people come across party lines from across government, and they use data to try to figure out how they can make their system stronger. So it's not a particular policy package. It's an approach that states employ. and that's the phase one is this analysis of data. In order for a state to participate, the governor and the legislative leadership and the Chief Justice need to actually sign a letter saying this is something they want to do. In fact, this is what Governor Brownback just did with legislative leaders in Topeka not long ago. They just signed a bill into law. This is their kickoff ceremony. In West Virginia, for example, the governor, together with the state's leadership, also launched the process just this year. What they commit to is a very intensive process where you have hundreds of meetings, hours and hours of conversations, hundreds of thousands of data records analyzed. It's an extremely comprehensive process. And in the end, as you'll hear, we've seen legislation enacted that governors, from Governor Kasich, say from Governor Perdue, cite this as some of the single biggest accomplishments that they've seen in their states. Of course, once they actually enact the legislation, there's the complicated business of transforming the systems afterwards. It's one thing to say, as you'll hear, that all courts and prosecutors and defense attorneys, for example, must be using a risk assessment instrument to actually inform where a person goes. But a lot of these judges are actually independently elected in local counties, and actually changing their practice in 80 different counties for a state, for example, is an incredibly complicated process. That's when phase two starts. That's the thorny work of actually implementing the new policies. And that's also where the Justice Reinvestment process kicks in. The Department of Justice has been extremely helpful. And you'll see more about these lessons learned in the report that was released today. So that gives you a quick overview of the Justice Reinvestment process and how it's played out. We have the benefit, though, of being joined by people at the pinnacle of state government that have really engaged in this process and seen some terrific results. To my right is Jim Seward, who is the general counsel to the governor in South Dakota. He's going to talk a little about South Dakota's experience. David Geis was in the legislature when North Carolina first came to BJA and Pew to talk about justice reinvestment. Subsequently, when the Republican governor took over for the Democratic Governor Perdue, named David Geis as the commissioner of the head of corrections. At the end of the table is John Wetzel, who's the secretary for the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania, and he'll talk about what's happened there. We want this to be brief because we really want to have an exchange with you. So we're going to really just hear from each of these folks for a few minutes. And what I'm going to ask each of them to do is just talk a little bit about the problem that their state faced, the process they went through, and the legislation that they enacted and its impact. And so, Jim, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you in South Dakota.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I understand it's 72 degrees outside. The cherry blossoms are in full bloom, and it's Friday afternoon. So I won't be long because I understand we're the only ones standing between you and the weekend. Again, my name's Jim Seward, and I'm lucky enough for a couple years now to work for Governor Dugard in South Dakota. I used to be in private practice, and I've been an Army guy. I've tried court-martials in a tent in Afghanistan, and been a fireman and worked for the court system, been a prosecutor and a defense attorney. So I was fortunate when the governor asked me to take a look at the prison system in South Dakota. I had some different experiences, and I've worked with a lot of people in South Dakota. I was very fortunate to take that on, and today I'd just like to thank a couple people. Feels kind of like the Academy Awards. Pew Charitable Trust was instrumental in South Dakota. South Dakota is a conservative state. We have a fiscally conservative governor, very conservative legislature, and Pew Charitable Trust came in, worked with us. It was the most nonpartisan and bipartisan process I've ever seen. In addition to that, the Justice Center, Dr. O'Donnell, or Director O'Donnell, make her a doctor here soon, and BJA, and Right on Crime. For the conservatives in the audience, if you've never heard of rightoncrime.com, I urge you when you're bored this weekend to take a look at that website, because there's a long list of conservatives that have signed on to this process, and all of those groups really helped guide us through the process. In South Dakota, when my governor came into office in January of 2011, we began to take a look at state government, and the governor instituted serious budget cuts, 10% almost across the board budget cuts. If you imagine that happening here in Washington, you can imagine what that does to a government when you go through that process. And it was tough on the people, tough on the government, but it right-sized our government and got rid of the deficit. We were able to then start looking at some other reforms. In 2011, our women's prison was busting at the seams. The population had grown in South Dakota 500% in the last 35 years. Consequently, the budget grew 500%. From 2000 to 2010, the population of our women's prison doubled. I always tell gentlemen in South Dakota, if you're upset with your wife, wait a few days, we're probably going to lock her up. Then you won't have to worry about it. The prison overall grew 41% in those same 10 years. The budget was doing the same thing. And the governor said to myself as we were beginning this process, he said, Jim, I want you to take a look at this. Number one, because of the budget and the concerns. But number two, and probably most importantly, it's about humanity as much as it is anything else. If we're locking up a bunch of nonviolent folks that we shouldn't lock up, we really should take a look at that, and we shouldn't be afraid to take a look at ourselves. We looked at the data. The data showed that 81% of all our prison new commitments to prison in 2012 were for nonviolent felonies, 81%. As such, the work group was formed. It was a bipartisan, interbranch, all three branches of government, the Chief Justice, the governor, legislative leaders signed on to it. We worked throughout all of 2012, drafted serious sweeping reform, and implemented that into legislation that was offered to the legislature in January, passed and signed in February, and now the state government is trying to implement all of those revisions. Some of the things we did very quickly, the timer will cut me off here in 30 seconds. Very quickly, we expanded things like drug courts and DUI courts and HOPE courts that Judge Alm started in Hawaii. If you haven't had a chance to learn about those, I'd urge you to check out the websites that talk about HOPE courts. We also introduced into South Dakota concepts like earned discharge on probation and parole so that resources can be focused on the folks who are most likely to reoffend early on, and the people that don't need to be supervised can go home and go to work and help the rest of us out. Many other things, some statutory reforms in our drug laws to try to differentiate between the serious crimes got more serious and the not so serious crimes got less serious, so we could focus.
I'm going to just jump in right here and turn over in a second to Commissioner Geis. Before I do, if you could just give folks a sense of what the actual budgetary impact was for South Dakota.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Over the next 10 years, South Dakota is expected to save between $162 and $200 million. We were going to be forced to build 2 new prisons in the next 8 years, and we believe these reforms will alleviate those concerns. And I must say our 3 goals of the work group were to improve public safety, hold offenders more accountable than we have been, and to reduce correction spending so we could reserve our prison beds for the most violent of offenders. And I think every policy we passed will do those 3 goals.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Seward. So I'm going to turn over to Commissioner Geis. Commissioner Geis, could you tell us about the problem that North Carolina really focused on as a result of the data analysis and then some of the policy changes that were enacted as a result?
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. And let me start off by saying that I worked 32 years as a officer, supervisor, and an administrator with the Department of Correction, Division of Community Correction in North Carolina, and retired, and had the opportunity and the honor to serve in the North Carolina legislature. When I arrived at the legislature, I thought I was actually going to be doing a wide range of things more on a regional level and focusing on those issues because I'd been a county commissioner for 8 years, 2 terms back home. But because of my background in the criminal justice field, the Speaker of the House and others asked me to serve on criminal justice issues. And it wasn't long before I met with a senator and some other members of the legislative body that were talking about the Council of State Government Justice Center, the folks at Pew, BJ, and they were talking about needing to come to a meeting to hear a presentation. And I was very busy doing a lot of different things, but went to that meeting. And I was not in that room 5 minutes before it clicked with me. And what clicked was the fact that this outside group had come in, and in a bipartisan way, we were looking at North Carolina data, not Texas data, not Kansas data, but North Carolina data, to try to analyze that data and come up with an approach that would be a data-driven approach to address criminal justice issues in North Carolina. Let me tell you what really jumped off the page. In 2009, there were new admissions to our prison system. 56% of the new admissions to the prison system were from probation revocations. And of that number, 73% were for technical violations. Folks, technical violations is a positive drug screen or failing to report to the office or some event like that, not a new criminal charge or criminal conviction or absconding supervision. The amazing thing, those beds cost us about $30,000 a year, and we were incarcerating low-level felons in the prison system. The other important fact was that in 1994, the biggest piece of reform legislation that we had had up until Justice Reinvestment was structured sentencing. And when it was passed in 94, since that time, 15,000 felons a year were being released without any supervision at all. Those things were astounding, but when they monitored the data, what they found was that within 24 to 36 months, they were spinning back, after being released, they were spinning right back into the front door of the judicial system. We had to do something about that. The urgency was upon us. Naturally, we were dealing with budget deficits and shortfalls, but this one piece of legislation was the only piece of legislation that passed that got the support of both the House and the Senate. And across the aisle, it passed just about unanimous in the House chamber and in the Senate chamber. Let me tell you what it did for North Carolinians. In my opinion, we got tougher on crime, but we got smarter in how we spent taxpayer dollars. And you say, well, what did you do? It's quite simple. We used a couple things. We used an assessment process. Every person that was placed under supervision, whether you're in the community or whether you go into the system, an assessment process is completed within 60 days. That assessment process drives how we supervise the offender, and it also provides the tools that we use. The courts gave us through the use of delegated authority, the ability to make those decisions. The staff in the field make those decisions. For years now, what's happened in North Carolina was we looked at a matrix. You looked at the particular charge the person had and their past history, and you came down and came across it automatically. Somehow it told you how that person was supposed to be supervised. Friends, today we're spending time by utilization of evidence-based practices where we sit knee to knee across from the offender and have a conversation. We're asking him or her about what caused them to make that poor decision that they made in their life. We spend the quality time with them, and the way that we're able to do that is the legislation requires us to have a caseload of 60 to 1 officer to 60 offenders. That is remarkable. Also, I will tell you that we learned from looking at the data, we were spending our treatment money without even having any measures in place to determine what we were getting. And an example of that is in North Carolina, we just quite simply gave to each county a lump sum of money based on the population of the community and looking at the offender population. We never asked, are the people sitting in the chair getting the treatment? They already had the money.
Commissioner Geist, I'm going to ask you a key question. I guess I have the slide up here showing the growth trends in your prison population. Can you talk a little bit about the decisions North Carolina was weighing when they were considering the legislation and what's happened since in terms of the prison population and the budget?
Yes, we were sitting around 41,000 at the time that we were considering whether or not we should implement justice reinvestment. The projection was we would be 43 to 45,000 within a 7-year period. Today, I'm proud to say that we implemented JR in 2011. Our prison population today, I think I checked yesterday, was 37,600. So as you can see, not only because of JR, there were some other issues too, but a great deal of it is attributed to JR. It would have cost us, if we would have had to build those prisons, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $262 million for bricks and mortar, and another $295 million over that time span to operate those prisons.
Instead, you've actually closed prisons since then.
Yes, sir. We're in the process this year. It's in the governor's budget. It's been recommended that we close 5 prisons. That will affect about 1,900 inmates and will save us about $34 million.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Commissioner Geis. And I should say that I know in South Dakota, we relied heavily on the direct technical assistance from the Pew Center on the states. I know that states like that are highlighted in the map earlier that I mentioned, such as Delaware and others, relied on VERA, for example, to provide that intensive technical assistance. And then there's that Phase 2 support that can come through a variety of places. And there's also the work of CJI as well as CEPP working with local county sites. I know that Director O'Donnell mentioned, and there's also friends here from the Urban Institute, which have served as a coordinator for all this and are evaluating it. So I want to then turn to Secretary Wetzel at Pennsylvania. And Secretary Wetzel, I know that when you assumed the head of the department, the state had been looking, or the Commonwealth had been looking at building a prison just about every year. Is that about right?
Yeah, we were adding approximately 2,000 inmates a year, and that's essentially one prison. And the construction cost of one prison for us is about $200 million, but the operational cost is another $60 million a year. So that's basically where we're at. Over the 10 years before we took over as administration, the population grew in the department 40%. Budget grew 77%. Those are two kind of alarming numbers, but they're not the most alarming. Let me give you the most alarming number. Of the people who got out, 62% were either reincarcerated or arrested. So you got a system that has grown to a point where it's cost $2 billion. And on top of that, it's not accomplishing much. Other than that, we were doing great. But sadly, in corrections, people don't pay for results. Nobody balks. In the 10 years before we came, the Department of Corrections got an increase every year. Our first year, I got an increase of $186 million in the budget. Nobody blinks an eye because we have this perception that if we lock people up, we're safer. And the reality is, if we lock the right people up in a place that has the right programs, when they get out, yeah, we are safer. But when we lock the wrong people up, we're not. On top of that, we had a community correction system that we were investing $110 million a year in. And let me tell you about this wonderful community correction system we had. 2009. Some of you appreciate sarcasm. Thank you. In 2009, we had Ed Latessa from Cincinnati come in and study our system. He found that we had 54 community corrections programs at the time. 53 of them, offenders who went in, came out more likely to commit another crime. That's a 5% success rate. In spite of that, we kept spending $110 million. Our administration, too. And you heard from our colleagues that this is a bipartisan, multidisciplinary. So I'm not going to say that again. But this is certainly what I'm not saying that this system was built by the previous administration. It's their fault. This is the approach we all have taken in corrections forever. So jump forward. We come in as an administration. Our governor, Tom Corbett, was the Attorney General. Known as law and order. Everybody assumed that we were going to, keep locking a bunch of people up. But one of the first things we did as administration, after writing out to these guys and saying, would you come in and do the justice reinvestment thing, is stop the construction of a prison. $200 million prison, we pulled the plug. For which my confirmation was held up for 4 months. Nice calm time for me and my 4 kids. But that was a signal that we're not going to try to build our way out of this. We weren't exactly sure what the solution was, but we were familiar with the justice reinvestment process. And the beautiful part about criminal justice is it does not have to be political. It does not have to be right versus left. Everybody wants a safe community. And when you have a system that is failing 62% of the time, nobody can make the argument that what you're doing makes sense. So we went through this process, and rest assured, states have as much bureaucracy as you guys do. It took us a year to start, as we were passing letters around to get people to sign stuff. But we started the process in January. We had 3 meetings. The folks from CSG worked hard, had a bunch of meetings, a bunch of briefings within the caucus. And I can't tell you how important that was in educating the members on everything we were doing. Everybody, all the members knew that our correction spending was going up. Nobody thought that we could control correction spending other than releasing a bunch of dangerous felons to the community. That's what everybody thought. But through this process, everybody in the system got educated, and so did the public, because we did it in a transparent manner, with editorial board meetings and articles and radio shows. So we really educated, and sitting around the table, and in our case, the district attorneys are very influential in these things. And the district attorneys sat there with us, and we identified what was leading to our population, and what policies we could get to have better outcomes, for the system to work better. And so just a couple policy tweaks that we made. The first thing is technical parole violators, as David talked about. That's an issue across the country. But we know that the research says that when you're dealing with folks who violate parole, swift and certain punishment works. Severity doesn't matter. So what were we doing? We were doing slow and very severe. And that led to not just bad costs, but bad outcomes. So we looked at that group, and we got consensus that we have to treat them differently. We also, as I mentioned, we had a community correction system that didn't work. That was very poor, and it was very poor for a couple reasons, not the least of which is we mixed a bunch of populations in there. So we really looked at who needed to be in community corrections, who was appropriate, based on their risk, not based on we have this program, so we're going to put this person in it. Individually, based on risk, where we're going to get the best outcome. We also identified a small group of charges who could never come to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Very small number, maybe about 100 people a year. But it was a big step for us as a state, because now we said that there's a group who aren't appropriate for state incarceration. Based on these changes, in the first 6 months after these changes were initiated, our population dropped by 500. Now, 500 in a 51,000 bed system, not huge, 1%, although we act like it was huge, so we got some good press, which, as you know, is very important. But it also is the biggest drop in 40 years in Pennsylvania. We're heading in the right direction, and we're doing it the right way by focusing on outcomes. For the community correction system in particular, we're just getting terrible outcomes. So what we did is we rebid the whole community correction system. And our community correction system, much like the federal system, we contract with a lot of vendors. So 38 of our centers are contract, 14 are state-run. We rebid the whole system, but we changed the expectations on the vendors. And we said to the vendors, we're going to establish a baseline recidivism rate. You will be paid based on your ability to impact the bottom line, based on your ability to improve people, because that's what we're paying you to do. I'm not paying vendors to let offenders play Xbox and watch Jerry Springer at $70 a day. I'm paying them to do the things that make them less likely to commit a crime. And now we're going to measure that, and if they reduce recidivism, they get a bonus. If they do not reduce recidivism, they keep it the same, they don't get a bonus. And if they're increasing recidivism, we end their contract.
So I'm going to jump there, Secretary Wetzel, because there is a lot of space between the two of us. You are a much larger man than I, let me stop there, and we want to open this up for questions, and you're going to hear me repeat your question. That's not just for the sake of repeating it, but because we're recording this, and we do want to get a chance for people who weren't able to be here, get a sense of what the questions were that were asked. So with that, we'll open up the floor to questions. So nationally, I know that we often hear that what's driving the prison population are more and more people going to prison for nonviolent drug crimes. Question being, when you were looking at your growth, to what extent was that driving it? And to the extent you addressed it, how, and did you actually look at any reinvestment in treatment for that particular population? Secretary Wetzel, in Pennsylvania, again, I know there's a big question about it's nonviolent, low-level drug crimes that are driving the population. Is that in fact what was the case in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's a big piece of our increase. And what we did from a policy standpoint, and a legislative standpoint, is number one, focused on making sure that judges had the tools to make good decisions at who needed to come to us. Focused on that outcome. And in 2008, there was a provision passed that the Sentencing Commission develop a risk-based sentencing tool. So the judge has a risk assessment before they make that decision of whether a person needs to come to a state prison or stay local. But that wasn't funded. So through the reinvestment, we tagged money so that's funded. So that's the first thing in making good decisions at who comes to us. But also on the back end, focusing specifically on, we put specific expectations for the vendors and for our community correction system on what programming to deliver, how to assess it. So we focused both better treatment and treatment within the facility at those. We did not, some areas that we did not go to through the policy changes and the legislation, we didn't touch mandatory minimums. We could not build consensus for that. And so this process is about building consensus. So we did not do that, but we put some pieces in place so we're making better decisions at the front end. And hopefully as we continue to look at our system, that's an area, because at place of confinement and making sure that we don't send the lower risk people to a prison where they come out higher risk is really where we need to get to.
Commissioner Geis, I know we often hear about well-meaning judges who see a person, a low-level drug offender. Let's say that they're a 40-year-old person with a job, and they say, I know just what you need. You're going to get residential treatment, and you're going to get intensive probation so we can get your life back on track. Why is that actually making things worse in some ways?
Well, it makes things worse because you're setting the person up to fail. In that that individual, if they have the job already, and then you're requiring of them to do specific things that would require them to miss work, to make an appointment, etc., those things just do not work. You've got to have that flexibility, and the flexibility really needs to be provided and be driven by that assessment instrument that is going to tell us exactly how we need to supervise that individual. Also in North Carolina, I'd like to point out that we did a couple things. One, the assessment instrument, I've mentioned that. The second thing that I mentioned is that we did something about our treatment money. Instead of those dollars just being handed out, we contracted out for exactly the type of programs that we want to see, that we know that are effective. We know that cognitive behavior intervention, CBI, is extremely important and will assist us. But the other thing that we did, I think, is important. We provided a provision that if this person was charged and standing before the judge, and it was their first offense, and it was a possession of drugs, not just marijuana, but drugs, that person, and it's not that the judge has a choice here, that person shall receive a deferred prosecution case, simply meaning they've got to complete a certain period of supervision, do certain things such as treatment, etc., and when they complete that, then their record is wiped clean. Now, they've got to complete it, but this is extremely important, and we provided that because once a person's tagged, they're tagged for life.
So what you're hearing here, I think, is a couple things. One is, in the case of North Carolina, where you did really have a part of the package was, in fact, a diversion of low-level drug offenders, for example, actually mandated by the law. Secretary Wetzel talking about some things on the back end and the front end that were done also to affect this population. But I think what you hear everybody saying is need to be very careful that we're not just cookie cutter approaching this population and saying this is the kind of treatment program and community supervision that you get, because if we do that in too uniform of a way, we could actually increase their recidivism rates, right? And you hear everybody talking about these assessment tools to drive that decision making. And so we're talking there about these actuarial tools, these science-based instruments, right? Not just the best judgment of a prosecutor, or judge, and defense attorney about what would make sense, but these science-based tools to figure out who would benefit from what. And sometimes we find that we actually have a low-level drug offender who's actually been involved in property crime, who's at very high risk of reoffense. And in those cases, we actually do want to throw everything we have at the person to make sure they don't reoffend. There was a question over here, I believe.
Yes, different now.
So Jim Seward, you saw the prison population, as you mentioned earlier, growing in South Dakota fivefold. Governor's newly elected. What was different in that situation than, say, his predecessor to tackle this issue?
Well, obviously the population's important, the money's important, but when you take a look at what's going on around the rest of the country, in the last 10 years, 17 states have lowered their imprisonment rate, and their crime rate's also gone down. So when we started to look at this process, we looked at corrections and we said, you know, corrections is the one part of state government that doesn't get evaluated in terms of, are we getting the best bang for our buck? So we compared the U.S. crime rate to the South Dakota crime rate. And in the last 10 years, the U.S. crime rate went down 19%. The South Dakota crime rate only went down 9%. Their imprisonment rate, U.S.-wide, only went up 1.6%, and our imprisonment rate went up 18%. So we were imprisoning many more people, and our crime rate was not coming down the way that it was in the rest of the country.
Another question here. I do want to just mention that you're hearing a lot about justice reinvestment. You're hearing a lot, too. We talk about the Second Chance Act and the investments that that's created for particular programs around reentry. I know that Congressman Scott is circulating a Dear Colleague letter in support of funding for this different kind of work. And I will say from our part of the Council of State Governments Justice Center, certainly hope that's something that you can be encouraging your principals to sign on to if they haven't already. There's a question over here. Timely question. We were literally talking about this extensively over the past couple of days, so I'm thrilled that you asked. The question of, as we look at changes in incarceration rates, to what extent is that disproportionately affecting people of color? I know that Jim Seward talks about the tribal populations and the extent to which that's driving South Dakota's population. I know Secretary Wetzel, we were talking about, as you were looking at the change in the prison population in Pennsylvania, the extent to which that change was occurring principally among people of color. Can you elaborate, and then I'll ask Jim to talk about it?
Yeah, I can't give you the exact numbers because we just started seeing it, but it's also, I've been talking to colleagues around the country, and what we're seeing is as the population drops, generally most of the reduction are people of color. And I think yesterday, our friend from Connecticut said specifically 100% of their reduction was for people of color. So people are starting to, and academia are starting to talk about a whitening of the population. But really what it is the disproportion is getting slightly less disproportionate.
Mr. Stewart, do you want to talk about the tribal impact and the...
Certainly. In South Dakota, we have 9 Indian reservations, and under federal law, they're really seen as separate nations. So you can imagine trying to take someone that's part of the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections and place them on parole in a mostly white community that's far from the reservation and far from where they grew up, and tell them, okay, here's your $50 gate money, go get a job, you should probably get a car, a driver's license, and get a house, okay? Parole wasn't very successful, or hasn't been very successful. The Native Americans in South Dakota make up 9% of our state population, but 47% of our parole violations. So one of the things that we're doing through this process, and it's really based on evidence-based practices, we're trying to develop a parole tribal pilot on a couple different reservations so that we can have individuals go back home to their reservation and be on parole, be under the jurisdiction of the state and the tribe through a cooperative agreement, work together, and try to hold them accountable with swift and certain sanctions in their community to really try to make an impact in that area.
Ann Seymour, I'm just thrilled to see you here. I hope you don't mind me calling on you.
You're going to yell at me?
On the contrary, I know far better than to yell at Ann Seymour. Ann Seymour, for those of you who don't know, is an extraordinary advocate for victims of crime and survivors. I think a lot of people still have the question of, how is this something that survivors of crime and their families would actually be interested in and see as something that would be potentially good? Can you talk just a little bit about why this is something that the victim community has actually been particularly interested in?
Well, I think for every reason that Denise started with, we're talking about something that actually works. And in 2 of the states that are represented here, quite a bit of the reinvestment has been into more effective crime victim services. So it's something that the victim community strongly embraces. And part of it is the process. And y'all have talked about the bipartisan whatever you've been saying. There's all kinds of things that are required for justice reinvestment. But we've not gone into a state where we have not proactively engaged crime survivors and the advocates who serve them, and had great, I learned a lot about tribal issues from the roundtable we had in South Dakota. So I think a big part of it is that victims are used to not being at the table with any justice policy discussions, and in every single state here, in the states that have been on the maps, that is part of the process, and I think a critical part of the process.
So huge engagement from crime victims at the outset, and when we see reinvestment, a significant focus on victim services and victim restitution, which is really, I think, further excited deservedly and appropriately so, the victim community. Any other questions from folks? Yes, ma'am. Indigent defense services, has that been a focus of the reinvestment in any of these states?
No. In Pennsylvania, how that's funded is by county. And there's a part of the savings that's being reinvested back to the counties, and the counties will dictate where that money goes to, but that's a county-by-county decision. So that component, probably 18 to 24 months from now, we'll see. And at that point, we'll see if any of that money gets reallocated for that. I suspect if there's some places, counties have some case flow issues, and some of it comes to access to attorneys and those kinds of things. So if they're looking at that case flow, sometimes that's an investment they'll make. But part of what was important for our structure, which is consistent with the approach of this, is that it has to be a local kind of decision at how that money's spent.
Jim, did you want to answer?
Yeah, we did 2 things in South Dakota that might directly or indirectly affect what you're talking about. One of the things that we did was set up a centralized restitution collection system, and the reason that's so important to indigent defense is in South Dakota, each county is responsible for paying those bills, and then many times the defendant, after the case is over, must pay those back. As you know, resources are very limited at the county level as well. This is going to greatly increase. We have millions and millions and millions of uncollected restitution and attorney's fees. As those are collected and go back into that pool, it'll provide more money for indigent defense. And then the second thing we did this year, which was attorneys, we have, if you haven't been to South Dakota, you should come see Mount Rushmore and the many other beautiful things we have. But while you're there, you'll also see some wide open spaces. You can drive in a few places for a couple 100 miles and never run into anything except maybe a deer or an antelope. But so we have some communities out there that don't have attorneys in them. And if somebody is in the system and they can't get an attorney, that can be a huge detriment. If you're an attorney like me, you think we're very necessary. So one thing we did, it's the first in the country, and it was just highlighted in the New York Times, we did a bill through our law school to incentivize a few students each year to go out into the hinterland and set up their law practice, and we're going to help them pay for law school if they promise to do that for 5 years.
I do think, though, we're always looking at ways in which we can improve this process, and I think certainly defense attorneys, public defenders have been at the table. I know in each of the states where we've worked, we have seen, though, how critical they are to the successful implementation of a number of things we're talking about. Just for example, in Hawaii, we talked about improving the pretrial decision-making process and talked about just the discussions back and forth between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, how that was slowing things down, how trying to give them objective risk assessment information seemed like the right thing to do. The defense attorneys raising potential issues and challenges with that. And so I think what we're starting to see is, not only what a pivotal role defense counsel plays in this and how they need to be engaged, but also how some of the strategies really need to be focused on that particular constituency to make this work. So I appreciate you asking that question. Other questions? I know we're nearing the end here, and as was mentioned at the outset, we are on a Friday afternoon. I want to say one last thing before I do. Director O'Donnell, just a chance for you to close out. Again, BJ has been so instrumental in making this happen. Any closing remarks?
So thanks. Well, first of all, I wanted to recognize Christine Leonard, who's there, she and Vera, who've been such great partners with JRI. But I really just want to kind of close by saying that the President's 2014 budget is really strongly supporting JRI, and I know our co-sponsors here today have been strong supporters of JRI. So if there is a possibility of making a wise investment in criminal justice funding, JRI is that smart investment. It would allow us to provide services, training, and technical assistance to more states, and believe me, there's a demand for that. It would allow us to focus more on the implementation phase of JRI, which is so extremely important, and allow us to provide more funding to states to really kickstart the changes that they have legislated in their state. So I think it's so smart to invest in states that have gone through this process and have put so much effort into realigning their system. So we're 100% behind it and hope that we'll have a lot of support here for doing that. So thank you very much.
Director O'Donnell, thank you. Again, to emphasize, you're hearing these inspiring stories from these states because of what Congress has done in order to fund some of this program initially. These states, though, however, remain in the minority. And there are lots more states that are out there that are hearing the news about what's happening in these places and want to replicate this in theirs. And so that's why it's so important not only that this continue, but really be expanded to meet that demand. And then furthermore, recognizing the issue that, as we've said again and again, the work just begins when this legislation is passed. I made reference a little while ago to the things we're learning in the implementation phase of this and how much more work needs to continue there. So an incredibly important effort that you all, so many people in this room have helped make happen. I want to thank again the people who helped us secure the room and have hosted this meeting, Congressman Wolf, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Chavis, Congressman Scott, and Congressman Schiff. Thank you very much, and thank you to these wonderful state leaders and Director O'Donnell. We're really grateful to all of you.